The most expensive mistake a CEO can make isn't losing money. It's underestimating the person sitting in his lobby. By the time Richard Coleman finally realized who Angela Brooks was, she had already been waiting in the reception area of Coleman Technologies for 2 hours and 47 minutes. And in less than 20 more minutes, a decision worth $500 million would hang in the balance. Angela sat quietly in a leather chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, her hands folded neatly across a slim portfolio resting on her lap. She wore a navy blazer, simple pearl earrings, and comfortable flats. Nothing about her appearance screamed billionaire investor. Nothing announced that she controlled one of the most influential private investment firms in America. To everyone walking past her that morning, she looked like an ordinary business visitor waiting for an appointment that had run behind schedule. At exactly 9:03 a.m., Angela had introduced herself to the receptionist with a warm smile. "Good morning. I'm Angela Brooks. I have a 9 o'clock meeting with Mr. Coleman." The receptionist, a young woman named Emily, had typed quickly into her computer before her expression shifted slightly. "Mr. Coleman is running a little behind, Ms. Brooks. He'll be with you shortly." Angela had nodded graciously. "No problem at all." 45 minutes later, 3 executives arriving after her had already been escorted upstairs. An hour after that, 2 vendors and a consulting team had also been welcomed into conference rooms. Angela remained in the lobby. Several employees passed by without a second glance. Others noticed her still sitting there and exchanged uncomfortable looks. One junior analyst even whispered to a coworker, "Has that woman been waiting here all morning?" Meanwhile, on the 32nd floor, Richard Coleman was leading a leadership meeting. Tall, confident, and known for making rapid judgments, Richard prided himself on reading people within seconds. Earlier that morning, while crossing the lobby, he had briefly noticed Angela sitting alone. "Who's waiting downstairs?" he had casually asked his executive assistant. "Angela Brooks. I think she's here for the investment meeting." Richard barely slowed his pace. "Have her wait. If she's representing a serious fund, she'll understand how executive schedules work." Then, after another glance toward the lobby, he had added quietly, "Besides, major investors usually don't show up looking like that." No one challenged him. Back downstairs, Angela checked the time on her watch. 11:50 a.m. Nearly 3 hours. Yet she showed no frustration. Instead, she calmly answered a phone call. Emily couldn't help overhearing part of the conversation. "Yes, postpone the New York board review until tomorrow," Angela said softly. "And tell Marcus not to finalize anything until after my Chicago meeting." Emily frowned. "New York board review? Marcus?" Something about the conversation didn't match the image everyone seemed to have of this patient woman sitting alone in the lobby. Then Angela ended the call, smiled politely at Emily once again, and returned to waiting as if she had all the time in the world. Emily tried to focus on her screen, but she kept glancing toward Angela every few minutes. Most visitors who had been left waiting for nearly 3 hours would have shown signs of irritation. They would sigh loudly, complain, pace across the lobby, or demand answers. Angela Brooks did none of those things. Instead, she remained composed, occasionally reviewing documents on her tablet or responding quietly to messages on her phone. Shortly after noon, Richard Coleman's executive assistant, Sandra Pierce, stepped off the elevator and approached the reception desk carrying a stack of folders. "Has the investment group arrived yet?" she asked hurriedly. Emily looked confused. "I thought that was scheduled for 1 o'clock. Sandra stopped walking. "No, the board moved it to 9 this morning. Mr. Coleman specifically wanted everyone here early." Emily hesitated before pointing discreetly toward Angela. "There is a Ms. Angela Brooks here for a 9 o'clock meeting. She has been waiting since this morning." Sandra frowned. "Angela Brooks?" Before Emily could answer, Sandra's phone rang. After a brief conversation, she shook her head. "Never mind. Mr. Coleman needs these reports immediately." She rushed back toward the elevator without another question. Angela looked up briefly, then returned to reading. At 12:18 p.m. A luxury sedan pulled up outside the building entrance. The driver remained inside, checking his watch repeatedly. A valet approached the vehicle and later mentioned to security that the driver had already been waiting for over 2 hours. "Must be somebody important," one guard commented. "Nobody keeps a private driver sitting that long unless they are used to tight schedules." Meanwhile, on the 32nd floor, Richard was finishing lunch with several senior executives. The conversation turned toward the upcoming investment presentation. "Who exactly is representing Brooks Capital?" asked Chief Financial Officer Daniel Reeves. Richard shrugged casually. "Some consultant or mid-level representative, apparently. Whoever it is has already been waiting downstairs all morning." Daniel looked surprised. "You made them wait this long?" Richard smiled confidently. "Daniel, people seeking business with us wait. That is how these things work." Another executive quietly replied, "Brooks Capital manages over $20 billion in assets. I would not keep anyone from that firm waiting." Richard waved dismissively. "Trust me, if this meeting were truly important to them, they would have sent someone more senior." Back in the lobby, Emily finally gathered enough courage to approach Angela. "Ms. Brooks, I am really sorry about the delay. Would you like coffee or lunch while you wait?" Angela offered her a kind smile. "That is thoughtful, Emily, but I am fine. Thank you." Emily hesitated. "Can I ask something? Are you really with Brooks Capital?" Angela closed her tablet gently. "I am." Emily swallowed nervously. "What do you do there?" Angela smiled again, this time with a hint of mystery. "I help make final decisions." Before Emily could ask another question, Angela's phone rang once more. She answered immediately. "Hello, Marcus." She listened quietly for several seconds. "No, do not sign anything yet," she said calmly. "I want to meet the leadership team in person before I decide whether we move forward." Emily froze. For the first time that morning, she began to wonder whether the woman everyone had overlooked might be far more important than anyone upstairs realized. At 12:37 p.m., subtle tension began spreading through the executive floor. Daniel Reeves stood outside the main boardroom reviewing the afternoon agenda when he noticed something unusual. The first item listed simply read, "Strategic Partnership Review with A. Brooks." There was no title, no company representative designation, and no supporting presentation attached. Daniel frowned. Every major investment meeting normally included detailed briefing materials. Curious, he opened the internal investor profile database. Seconds later, his expression changed completely. Brooks Capital was not simply another investment firm. It had acquired significant positions in several Fortune 500 companies over the past decade, and Angela Brooks herself was listed as founder and executive chair. Daniel immediately looked toward Sandra. "Has anyone actually met Ms. Brooks yet?" Sandra shook her head. "No." Richard said someone from their team arrived this morning, but he did not seem concerned. Daniel stared at the screen. Richard should be very concerned. Meanwhile, downstairs, the atmosphere in the lobby had shifted. Word had quietly spread among several employees that the woman still waiting near the windows might be connected to Brooks Capital. A few staff members passed by more slowly, studying Angela with curiosity. Yet Angela remained exactly as she had been all morning, composed, patient, and impossible to read. Shortly before 1 o'clock, a young manager named Kevin Marshall entered the lobby carrying documents. He stopped abruptly when he noticed Angela. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Are you Ms. Brooks?" Angela nodded. "I am." Kevin introduced himself nervously. "I attended an economic leadership conference in Boston last year. I think you delivered the keynote address." Angela smiled warmly. "That was a wonderful event. I hope you found it useful." Kevin almost dropped his folders. He remembered that keynote very clearly. The speaker had received a standing ovation from more than 2,000 executives. The idea that the same person had been sitting unnoticed in the lobby for nearly 4 hours suddenly seemed unbelievable. "Would you like me to contact someone upstairs?" Kevin asked. Angela glanced at her watch. "Thank you, Kevin, but I believe they already know I am here." Her answer was calm, but something about it unsettled him. Upstairs, Richard finally entered the boardroom. Several directors had already arrived through video conference from New York, San Francisco, and Dallas. As he took his seat, board member Linda Foster immediately asked, "Has Ms. Brooks joined us yet?" Richard leaned back confidently. "Not yet. We are still waiting on Brooks Capital." Linda looked surprised. "That is strange. Angela is never late." Another director added, "I spoke with her assistant yesterday. She specifically confirmed she would attend in person." Richard felt a slight irritation. "Well, she certainly is not here." At that exact moment, Sandra quietly stepped into the room and handed Richard a note. It contained only one sentence. "Ms. Angela Brooks has been waiting in the lobby since 9:03 this morning." Richard stared at the note for several seconds. Before he could respond, Linda Foster spoke again through the large video screen. "Richard, I hope there has been no misunderstanding. Angela Brooks personally decides where Brooks Capital invests. If she is unhappy, there will not be a second meeting." Richard Coleman felt the room grow noticeably quieter. He read Sandra's note a second time, hoping he had misunderstood it. "Ms. Angela Brooks has been waiting in the lobby since 9:03 this morning." Richard slowly looked up. "There must be some mistake," he said. Sandra shook her head carefully. "There is no mistake. She checked in personally with reception this morning." Linda Foster's voice came through the speaker system immediately. "Richard, please tell me you did not leave Angela Brooks sitting in your lobby for 4 hours." Richard forced a small laugh. "I briefly saw someone downstairs this morning, but she did not appear to be." He stopped himself. Linda noticed. "Did not appear to be what?" Richard adjusted his tie. "I assumed she was a junior representative." No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel Reeves quietly said, "Brooks Capital does not send junior representatives to half-billion-dollar negotiations." Richard suddenly felt defensive. How was I supposed to know? There was nothing that indicated who she was. Daniel looked directly at him. "Her name, Richard. Her name indicated who she was." The boardroom became uncomfortably silent. Downstairs, Angela remained seated peacefully near the windows. Emily had started noticing something else unusual. Throughout the morning, several employees had unknowingly walked past one of the most powerful investors in corporate America. Yet Angela had treated every person she encountered with patience and respect. When a maintenance employee accidentally dropped a stack of supplies nearby, Angela immediately stood and helped gather them. When a nervous intern spilled coffee while rushing through the lobby, Angela reassured her with a smile and napkins from the reception desk. Emily could not stop thinking about the contrast between Angela's behavior and the dismissive attitude she had witnessed from senior executives upstairs. At 1:12 p.m. another call came through on Angela's phone. "Hello, Marcus," she answered calmly. She listened for nearly a minute. "I understand," she said. "However, I prefer making decisions after meeting leadership face-to-face. Numbers matter, but culture matters more." Emily could not help overhearing the final sentence. Culture matters more. The words lingered in her mind. Upstairs, Richard finally stood from his chair. "Fine. I will bring her up personally." Before he could leave, Linda Foster spoke again. "Richard, I strongly suggest that when you meet Angela, you spend more time listening than talking." Richard nodded stiffly and left the boardroom. As he entered the executive elevator, he replayed the morning in his mind. He remembered seeing Angela sitting alone near reception. He remembered assuming she was not important. He remembered deciding that other meetings deserved priority. For the first time that day, uncertainty began replacing confidence. The elevator doors opened into the lobby. Richard immediately spotted Angela sitting exactly where he had first seen her hours earlier. She looked up as he approached. "Ms. Brooks," Richard said, forcing a professional smile, "I sincerely apologize for the delay. We are finally ready for our meeting." Angela slowly closed her tablet and stood. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman," she replied politely. Then she looked at her watch before adding in the same calm tone she had maintained all morning, "I was beginning to wonder whether this meeting was still important to your company." Richard forced a polite smile, but Angela's question unsettled him. Of course it is important, he replied quickly. There have simply been several unexpected scheduling issues this morning. Angela studied him for a brief moment. I understand. Unexpected situations happen in business. Her calm response offered no indication of what she was truly thinking, which somehow made Richard even more uncomfortable. As they walked toward the executive elevator, employees throughout the lobby quietly watched. Emily noticed something she had never seen before. Richard Coleman, a man known for moving through the building with absolute confidence, suddenly seemed unusually careful with every word. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was almost silent. Richard attempted small talk. I understand Brooks Capital has been very active in the technology sector recently. Angela nodded. We have. We look for companies with strong long-term leadership. Richard smiled. I believe you will find that here. Angela looked directly at him. Leadership is always interesting to evaluate in person. Richard felt his stomach tighten. When the elevator doors opened, Sandra was already waiting. Ms. Brooks, welcome. The board is assembled and ready. Angela shook Sandra's hand warmly. Thank you, Sandra. As they approached the boardroom, several executives straightened in their seats. The atmosphere changed immediately when Angela entered. Board members joining remotely smiled with obvious recognition. Angela, it is wonderful to finally see you again, Linda Foster said from New York. Thank you, Linda. It has been far too long, Angela replied comfortably. Richard immediately realized that several directors knew Angela personally. The realization was deeply unsettling. Sandra distributed meeting materials, but Angela did not open hers. Instead, she quietly observed the room. Richard began his presentation with confidence, discussing revenue projections, market expansion plans, and anticipated growth over the next 5 years. For nearly 20 minutes, Angela listened without interruption. Then she asked her first question. Mr. Coleman, your presentation emphasizes innovation and customer relationships. How would you describe your company's internal culture? Richard blinked. I would say we maintain a highly professional environment. Angela nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. What specific practices ensure that every employee, customer, vendor, and visitor receives equal respect and attention? The room became noticeably quieter. Richard answered cautiously. We strive to treat everyone professionally. Angela folded her hands calmly. Strive is an admirable goal. Results are usually more revealing. Daniel Reeves lowered his eyes toward the conference table. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Angela continued. At Brooks Capital, we have learned that culture often reveals itself during ordinary interactions rather than formal presentations. Richard sensed that the conversation was no longer about quarterly earnings. I agree, he replied carefully. Angela offered a polite smile. Good. Then perhaps you can help me understand something. She paused just long enough for every person in the room to focus completely on her. What message does a company send when an invited guest is left waiting in its lobby for nearly 4 hours, while less significant appointments are repeatedly prioritized? No one spoke. Even the directors participating remotely remained silent. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman found himself completely without an immediate answer. Richard cleared his throat and adjusted the papers in front of him. Ms. Brooks, first, let me apologize again for the delay. This morning became unusually complicated, and unfortunately your meeting was affected. Angela nodded politely. I appreciate the apology, Mr. Coleman. Delays happen. What interests me more is understanding why the delay happened. Richard hesitated. As Chief Executive Officer, I often have to prioritize multiple demands simultaneously. Angela maintained steady eye contact. That is true for every leader. The question is how those priorities are determined. The room remained silent. Linda Foster finally spoke through the video screen. Angela has always believed that organizational culture begins at reception and extends all the way to the boardroom. Angela smiled slightly. Exactly. Financial statements tell me how a company performed yesterday. Culture tells me how it will perform 5 years from now. She opened her portfolio for the first time and removed several documents. Brooks Capital has evaluated more than 200 acquisition opportunities during the past decade. We rejected most of them. Richard leaned forward. May I ask why? Angela looked around the room. Because leadership habits reveal future risks. She continued calmly. When leaders make assumptions about people before learning who they are, they create blind spots. Blind spots eventually become expensive. Daniel Reeves slowly nodded. Several executives avoided eye contact entirely. Angela continued. This morning provided me with an unexpected opportunity. I arrived prepared to discuss a strategic investment. Instead, I spent almost 4 hours observing your organization. Richard immediately became concerned. Observing. Angela nodded. I observed employees who treated strangers kindly despite having little authority. I observed staff members who appeared uncomfortable but felt unable to speak up. I observed a reception team attempting to remain professional while navigating unclear priorities. Most importantly, I observed how decisions flow through this company. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. This was no longer an investment presentation. It had become an evaluation. Angela continued. Do you know who impressed me most today? Richard shook his head. Emily at reception, Angela replied immediately. She showed empathy, professionalism, and accountability despite difficult circumstances. She repeatedly apologized for decisions she did not make. That demonstrates character. Sandra quietly smiled. Everyone in the room knew Emily was one of the company's newest employees. Angela turned another page. I also spoke briefly with a young manager named Kevin Marshall. He recognized me from a conference, yet he approached me respectfully without making assumptions. That also demonstrates character. Richard felt increasingly uneasy. Angela had spent hours studying people throughout the building while everyone assumed she was simply waiting. Ms. Brooks, Richard said carefully, I hope you will not judge the entire organization based on one unfortunate morning. Angela folded her hands. I never judge organizations based on a single event, Mr. Coleman. I judge them based on patterns. She paused. Before coming here, Brooks Capital conducted extensive research. We found several employee surveys mentioning concerns about communication, accessibility, and executive culture. Richard's expression changed immediately. Those surveys had never been discussed publicly. Angela continued in the same calm tone. This morning did not create concern. It confirmed concern. The words landed heavily across the room. For the first time since the meeting began, Richard realized that the $500 million investment was no longer the most important issue on the table. The future of his leadership might be. Richard sat motionless for several seconds. Around the table, no one seemed eager to rescue him from the silence. Angela Brooks had not raised her voice once. She had not accused anyone directly. Yet somehow, every person in the room understood exactly what she was saying. Linda Foster finally broke the silence. Angela, would you be willing to share your overall assessment? Angela nodded thoughtfully. Certainly. Coleman Technologies has impressive products, talented employees, and strong market potential. Financially, the company is attractive. Operationally, there are many strengths. Richard visibly relaxed. Then Angela continued. However, Brooks Capital does not invest solely in products. We invest in leadership teams. Leadership determines whether long-term value is created or destroyed. Richard leaned forward. I assure you that our leadership team is fully committed to improvement. Angela looked directly at him. Commitment is important. Humility is equally important. Daniel Reeves quietly cleared his throat. Ms. Brooks, may I ask something? Angela smiled warmly. Of course. Daniel hesitated before speaking. You mentioned patterns earlier. Based on your experience, can organizations change those patterns? Angela nodded immediately. Absolutely. But only when leaders are willing to examine themselves honestly. She paused. The most dangerous leaders are not those who make mistakes. Every leader makes mistakes. The most dangerous leaders are those who believe they are incapable of making them. Several board members exchanged glances. Richard remained silent. Sandra, sitting near the back of the room, noticed something unusual. The directors participating remotely had begun sending private messages through the board portal. She could see notification icons appearing one after another. Whatever was being discussed, it was happening in real time. Angela opened another folder. Before today's meeting, Brooks Capital prepared 2 possible proposals. Richard looked surprised. 2? Yes, Angela replied calmly. One proposal involved a $500 million strategic investment accompanied by an expansion partnership. The second proposal recommended that we decline involvement entirely. The room became perfectly still. Which proposal were you leaning toward before arriving today? Linda Foster asked. Angela answered honestly. Before this morning, I favored the investment. Richard immediately sat straighter. Then perhaps we still have an opportunity to demonstrate why Coleman Technologies deserves your confidence. Angela studied him carefully. Perhaps. At that exact moment, Richard's phone vibrated. He glanced down and saw a message from board chairman Thomas Whitaker, who was attending remotely from Boston. The message was brief. We need an executive session immediately after this meeting. Richard felt a wave of unease. Thomas rarely requested unscheduled executive sessions. Angela continued speaking. Mr. Coleman, I want to be clear about something. My concern today is not personal. I have spent 30 years in business. I have been underestimated many times. I no longer take it personally. She paused before adding, what concerns me is what happens when someone without influence, wealth, or connections walks through these doors. How are they treated? No one answered. Angela continued, because if an invited investor can wait nearly 4 hours, I wonder what experiences your employees, customers, and vendors may have when no one important is watching. For the second time that afternoon, Richard found himself without an answer. And for the first time since becoming chief executive officer, he began to suspect that the conversation taking place around that table might determine far more than the future of a single investment. Thomas Whitaker's message remained on Richard's screen long after he locked his phone. Executive sessions were reserved for serious matters, usually involving acquisitions, succession planning, or leadership concerns. Richard had chaired dozens of them during his tenure as chief executive officer, but he had never been the subject of one. Across the table, Angela appeared completely at ease. She took a sip of water and reviewed a few notes before looking back at the board. I would like to discuss one final area before we move to financial terms, she said. Decision-making processes. Linda Foster nodded. Please continue. Angela displayed a slide on the conference screen. Several executives immediately recognized the data. It summarized employee retention, internal promotion rates, and leadership accessibility scores collected from publicly available surveys and independent research firms. Coleman Technologies has lost 37% of its mid-level managers during the past 3 years, Angela said. That figure is significantly above industry averages. Daniel Reeves looked surprised. You had access to that information? Angela smiled. Brooks Capital performs extensive due diligence. We believe people data is often more predictive than revenue data. She pointed to another chart. Your employee surveys consistently mention concerns about executive accessibility. Many employees describe senior leadership as distant, unapproachable, or selective in whom they engage with. Richard shifted in his seat. Anonymous surveys rarely provide complete context. Angela nodded. That is true, which is why I value direct observation. The room grew quiet again. Angela continued. This morning, I watched dozens of employees enter and leave this building. I noticed something interesting. Many greeted reception staff warmly. Very few senior leaders did. Sandra lowered her eyes. She had worked on the executive floor for 8 years and knew exactly what Angela meant. Culture is communicated through small moments, Angela said. Who receives attention? Who gets acknowledged? Who is considered important enough to deserve time? Thomas Whitaker finally spoke from Boston. Angela, Based on everything you have seen today, what is your recommendation? Richard immediately looked toward Angela. The answer would determine whether months of negotiations survived. Angela remained silent for several seconds. My recommendation, she said carefully, is that Brooks Capital postpone any final investment decision. Richard felt his heart sink. Postpone. Angela nodded. Temporarily. I still believe this company possesses tremendous potential. However, I cannot recommend a $500 million partnership until I understand whether leadership is prepared to address underlying cultural concerns. Richard spoke quickly. We are absolutely committed to improvement. Angela looked directly at him. Commitment begins with accountability. At that moment, Thomas Whitaker cleared his throat. Thank you, Angela. The board appreciates your honesty. He paused before continuing. Richard, once Ms. Brooks concludes her remarks, the independent directors will remain for a brief executive session. The words landed heavily. Every executive in the room understood what they meant. Richard understood as well. Angela slowly closed her portfolio. I did not come here intending to influence leadership discussions, she said calmly. I came here to evaluate an investment opportunity. What happens next belongs entirely to this board. Yet, as she gathered her papers, Richard realized that everything happening next had started the moment he decided that the woman waiting in his lobby was not important enough to see. Angela stood and shook hands with each board member, both in the room and on the video screens. Thank you for your time, she said graciously. I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about Coleman Technologies. As she turned toward the door, Thomas Whitaker spoke once more. Angela, regardless of the investment decision, thank you for your candor. Honest feedback is valuable. Angela smiled. Strong organizations welcome honest feedback, Thomas. That is often what separates good companies from great ones. She then left the boardroom with Sandra accompanying her to the elevator. The moment the doors closed behind them, the atmosphere inside the conference room changed dramatically. Thomas spoke first. Independent directors only, please. Richard looked around in disbelief. Thomas, surely we can discuss this together. Thomas shook his head. Not this conversation. One by one, the senior executives quietly gathered their materials and exited. Daniel Reeves hesitated before leaving. Richard, I think you should take some time before responding emotionally. Richard nodded stiffly, though he was already feeling something he had rarely experienced during his career. Uncertainty. Downstairs, Sandra walked Angela back toward the lobby. Ms. Brooks, she said quietly, I want to apologize personally for how today unfolded. Angela smiled kindly. Sandra, you have nothing to apologize for. You treated me with professionalism. Sandra hesitated. Still, it should not have happened. Angela nodded. No, it should not have. As they reached reception, Emily immediately stood. Ms. Brooks, it was truly a pleasure meeting you. Angela extended her hand. The pleasure was mine, Emily. Never underestimate the importance of kindness in business. People remember how they are treated long after they forget presentations. Emily smiled, unaware that those words would stay with her for years. Just as Angela prepared to leave, Richard emerged from a nearby elevator and hurried across the lobby. Ms. Brooks, do you have a moment? Angela turned. Of course. Richard took a deep breath. I owe you a more sincere apology than the one I offered earlier. I made assumptions this morning. Looking back, I realized that. Angela listened without interrupting. I appreciate your honesty, she replied. Richard continued. I hope you understand that my actions were never intended to be disrespectful. Angela considered his words carefully. Intent matters, Mr. Coleman, but impact matters too. Leaders especially must understand the difference. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. You are right. Angela continued in a calm voice. This morning was not really about me. I have the privilege of influence and resources. I can absorb inconvenience. The question every leader should ask is this: what happens to people who cannot? Richard said nothing. He understood exactly what she meant. Angela then added, Your company has remarkable potential. Whether that potential is realized depends entirely on the culture you choose to build. Her driver had already pulled the sedan to the entrance. Before stepping outside, Angela turned back one final time. For what it is worth, Mr. Coleman, the fact that you are standing here having this conversation gives me some hope. Then she walked out of the building, leaving behind a silent lobby and a chief executive officer who suddenly realized that the most important meeting of his career had never really been about money at all. After Angela's car disappeared into afternoon traffic, Richard remained standing near the lobby windows longer than anyone expected. Employees passed quietly, careful not to interrupt him. For years, Richard had built his reputation on decisiveness, confidence, and instinct. Those qualities had transformed Coleman Technologies from a regional software company into a national competitor. Yet for the first time in his career, Richard began questioning whether his instincts had become liabilities rather than strengths. Upstairs, the executive session had already begun. Thomas Whitaker called Richard 20 minutes later. "The board would like you to join us." Richard entered the boardroom knowing the conversation would be difficult. Thomas spoke first. "Richard, before we discuss anything else, I want to acknowledge your contributions to this company. No one questions your dedication." Richard nodded silently. Thomas continued. "However, today's events raised concerns that cannot be ignored." Linda Foster appeared on the large screen from New York. "Richard, this was not simply a scheduling mistake. Multiple directors have expressed concerns about leadership accessibility for quite some time." Another independent director added, "Employee retention numbers have also troubled us. We have discussed culture repeatedly during the past 2 years." Richard looked around the room. "Why am I hearing this now?" Daniel Reeves answered honestly, "Because today made the concerns impossible to dismiss." The words stung because Richard knew they were true. Thomas opened a folder. "Effective immediately, the board is authorizing an independent organizational culture assessment. We will interview employees at every level." Richard started to object, but Thomas raised his hand. "This is not optional." Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. "Understood." The meeting lasted another hour. By the time it ended, Richard felt emotionally exhausted. For years, he had focused almost exclusively on growth metrics, acquisitions, and shareholder value. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped paying attention to how people experienced the organization he led. The following morning, Richard arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. Instead of going directly to the executive floor, he stopped at reception. Emily looked surprised. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman." Richard smiled politely. "Good morning, Emily. How long have you worked here?" "Almost 7 months," she replied nervously. Richard hesitated before asking, "Yesterday, when Ms. Brooks was waiting, what were you thinking?" Emily looked uncertain. "Honestly, sir?" "Honestly," Richard said. Emily took a deep breath. "I thought it was wrong, but I did not feel comfortable challenging the decision." Richard remained silent. "Why not?" Emily looked down briefly. "Because around here, most people do not question executive decisions." Richard thanked her and walked away slowly. Her answer disturbed him more than anything Angela had said. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from Brooks Capital. Richard opened it immediately. The message was brief. Brooks Capital would postpone its investment decision for 90 days while monitoring organizational changes. However, Angela Brooks had personally requested quarterly updates regarding culture initiatives and employee engagement efforts. Richard read the message twice. It was not a rejection. It was something far more challenging. It was an opportunity to prove that change was possible. For the first time in years, Richard realized that earning $500 million might be easier than earning back trust. Over the next several weeks, Coleman Technologies began changing in ways employees had never seen before. The independent culture assessment authorized by the board moved quickly. Consultants interviewed employees from every department, from senior vice presidents to reception staff and maintenance crews. For the first time, people felt they could speak openly without fear of consequences. The findings were difficult to ignore. Many employees praised the company's mission and talented workforce, but recurring themes appeared throughout the report. Employees consistently described senior leadership as distant. Communication was often one-directional. Several employees admitted they avoided raising concerns because they believed their opinions would not matter. When the final report was presented to the board, Richard sat quietly as page after page confirmed what Angela Brooks had observed during only a few hours inside the building. Thomas Whitaker addressed the board directly. "We cannot dismiss these findings. If we want this company to succeed long-term, culture must become a strategic priority." Richard surprised everyone by agreeing immediately. "I spent years believing results justified everything," he said honestly. "I was wrong. We cannot build a great company if people do not feel respected." The admission marked a turning point. New initiatives were introduced almost immediately. Executive leaders were required to hold regular employee forums. Anonymous feedback systems were expanded. Leadership training became mandatory for all senior managers. Most noticeably, Richard established an open-door policy and personally committed to spending time each week meeting employees throughout the organization. At first, many employees remained skeptical. They assumed the changes were temporary or designed simply to impress Brooks Capital. However, Richard persisted. He regularly visited departments he had rarely entered before. He learned employees' names. He listened more than he spoke. One afternoon, Richard stopped by reception again. Emily looked up from her desk. "Good afternoon, Mr. Coleman." Richard smiled. "Emily, I wanted to thank you." She looked surprised. "For what?" "For being honest with me several weeks ago," Richard replied. "Your answer helped me understand problems I had failed to see." Emily smiled nervously. "I was worried I might have said too much." Richard shook his head. "You did exactly what good employees should do. You told the truth." Meanwhile, Brooks Capital monitored developments closely. Every month, Richard personally submitted progress reports to Angela. He never knew whether she read them herself, but detailed questions always came back. Questions about employee retention. Questions about leadership accessibility. Questions about accountability measures. 3 months after Angela's visit, Richard received an unexpected invitation. Brooks Capital requested a follow-up meeting. This time, the meeting would take place at Brooks Capital headquarters in New York. Richard arrived 30 minutes early. As he entered the reception area, he noticed something immediately. Every visitor was greeted warmly. No one was left waiting without updates. Every employee, regardless of position, was treated with equal courtesy. Richard could not help smiling. He finally understood that Angela had been teaching him a lesson long before the boardroom discussion ever began. And this time, when Angela Brooks entered the room, Richard stood immediately, extended his hand, and said with complete sincerity, "Thank you for giving us the opportunity to earn your trust again." The meeting at Brooks Capital lasted nearly 3 hours, but unlike their first encounter, every minute felt different. Richard noticed that Angela asked difficult questions just as she had before, yet the tone had changed. Instead of evaluating whether Coleman Technologies deserved consideration, she seemed focused on understanding whether meaningful transformation had actually taken place. "Tell me about the employee forums," Angela said as she reviewed the latest reports. Richard smiled slightly. At first, attendance was low. People assumed leadership was simply checking a box. But over time, participation increased. Employees started sharing concerns openly, and we acted on many of their suggestions. Angela nodded. "What was the most difficult feedback you received?" Richard did not hesitate. Several employees said they had stopped believing senior leadership cared about them. Hearing that was difficult because I realized they were right. Angela looked at him carefully. "And what did you do?" Richard leaned forward. "I stopped assuming I knew what people needed. I started listening instead." Angela exchanged a brief glance with Marcus Hale, Brooks Capital's chief operating officer. Marcus had been skeptical about giving Coleman Technologies a second chance. Now, for the first time, he appeared cautiously optimistic. During a break, Angela invited Richard to walk through Brooks Capital's headquarters. As they moved through the offices, Richard noticed something remarkable. Senior executives worked in open spaces alongside analysts and support staff. Conversations flowed naturally across departments. Everyone, from interns to vice presidents, greeted Angela comfortably. "You know all of their names?" Richard asked. Angela smiled. "Most of them." Richard looked genuinely impressed. "That must take effort." Angela nodded. "Leadership always takes effort. The moment leaders begin believing they are too important for ordinary interactions, they begin losing touch with reality." The words resonated deeply. Back in the conference room, Angela closed the final report and folded her hands. "Richard, when I first visited your company, I left uncertain whether Coleman Technologies was prepared for partnership." Richard remained silent. "Today, I see something different," Angela continued. "I see an organization willing to confront uncomfortable truths. More importantly, I see leadership willing to change." Marcus spoke next. "Employee retention has already improved. Internal survey scores are rising. Several former employees have even returned." Richard nodded. "We still have significant work ahead." Angela smiled. "Organizations never finish the work of building culture. The best leaders simply commit to doing it continuously." She opened a folder bearing the Brooks Capital logo and slid it across the table. Richard looked down. Inside was a formal investment agreement. Brooks Capital had approved the full $500 million strategic partnership. Richard looked up, visibly moved. "Thank you," he said quietly. Angela shook her head gently. "Do not thank me. Your employees earned this opportunity. They stayed, they spoke honestly, and they gave your company a chance to improve. Never forget that." As the agreements were signed later that afternoon, Richard realized something extraordinary. The investment that would transform Coleman Technologies financially had only become possible because one woman had been willing to tell an uncomfortable truth, and one leader had eventually been willing to hear it. 1 year later, Coleman Technologies looked very different from the company Angela Brooks had first encountered. Employee turnover had fallen to its lowest level in nearly a decade. Internal surveys showed record levels of trust in leadership. Customer satisfaction scores had improved significantly, and the strategic partnership with Brooks Capital had helped the company expand into new markets across the United States. Yet, the most important changes could not be measured on financial statements. They could be seen every morning in the lobby. Visitors were now greeted personally. Employees at every level felt comfortable sharing ideas and concerns. Senior executives regularly spent time outside their offices speaking with teams throughout the building. The culture had changed because the people leading the company had changed. Richard Coleman changed most of all. He still served as chief executive officer, but those closest to him often said he had become a different leader. He listened more. He asked questions before making assumptions. Most importantly, he never forgot the lesson he learned on that unforgettable day. One afternoon, nearly a year after their first meeting, Angela returned to Coleman Technologies for a quarterly partnership review. This time, Richard was waiting in the lobby before she arrived. When Angela entered the building, Richard walked forward immediately and greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome back, Angela. It is good to see you again." Angela looked around the lobby and noticed several small but meaningful changes. A digital welcome board displayed the names of all scheduled visitors. Reception staff had greater authority to assist guests. Employees moved through the space confidently and greeted one another naturally. "You have made remarkable progress," Angela said. Richard nodded. "We still have work to do, but we are moving in the right direction." As they walked toward the elevator, they passed Emily, who had recently been promoted to office operations manager. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," Emily said proudly. Angela smiled. "Congratulations on your promotion, Emily. It seems your company recognized talent when it saw it." Emily laughed. Eventually, everyone smiled, including Richard. Later, during the partnership meeting, Thomas Whitaker addressed the board. "The investment from Brooks Capital has delivered tremendous value, but I believe the greatest return came from something else entirely." He looked toward Angela. "You reminded us that leadership is not measured by titles, offices, or market capitalization. It is measured by how people are treated when there is nothing obvious to gain. The room grew quiet. Angela responded with the same calm humility she had shown from the beginning. Every person who walks through a company's doors deserves dignity and respect. You never know who they are, what they have accomplished, or what burdens they carry. But even more importantly, respect should never depend on those things in the first place. Richard nodded slowly. He knew those words were true because he had lived the consequences of forgetting them. Years later, employees at Coleman Technologies would still tell new hires the story of the woman who waited quietly in the lobby for nearly 4 hours. Not because she controlled $500 million, but because her patience, honesty, and grace transformed an entire organization. And Richard Coleman would often end leadership meetings with a simple reminder: treat every person with respect. Not because they might change your company, but because respect is who we choose to be.